Hello, and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. I'm a psychological astrologer as well as a analytical hypnotherapist, and I am delighted today to be in the company of the wonderful Clare Martin. Hello, Clare.
Hello, hi. Good to see
I
you.
was I was so excited the last time because we were talking about one of your books, which has remained a huge favorite since I first read it. And so I'm excited yet again because you've got another one, and it is this one. It is called Starcrossed. And so I think I'm just going to ask you to please tell us about Starcrossed. What is it about?
Okay, okay. Well, it's very, very different from the alchemy book, because it's rather than delving into the magical, mystical traditions of astrology, this is very much looking at astrology to see how and if and whether it it, it can make connections to personality theory, to standard mainstream modern psychological techniques and systems. And that's always been a question for me. What can the interface be? And how can astrology inform psychology? And vice versa? Is there anything that astrologers can learn from the discoveries of the systems theorists, the developmental psychologists who were working mainly in the 20th century developing their ideas about personality and how personality is structured. And it seemed to me that um, it would make sense that these two systems must have some kind of overlap, some kind of interface, some kind of ability to it be integrated. So um, this whole idea came out of the time when I was studying to be um, a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and it was the sort of nugget really that I came away with out of my psychotherapeutic training. I felt suddenly, because I was already an astrologer, I recognized so many of the astrological themes, and so I thought there must be a way to bring these two systems, two approaches together. And so, yeah, and that was many decades ago, and I've actually been developing this star-crossed, the idea, which is the ideas which are in this book, over quite a time, and testing them and seeing that they seem to resonate with people quite strongly. So, yeah, that's the origin of the book.
In your mind, what are the differences between psychology as it's practiced today and astrology?
Yeah, yes. Well, that's important because if we think of psychology as it's practiced today, it really emerged out of Freud's developments, and he was very keen that psychology should be seen as a science, and it has adopted the scientific language and analytical language. So, in that sense, psychology is linear, it's secular, it's yes, so it's based on um, developmental thinking. So one thing leads to another and is causal, so that our personalities are actually the result of our, our experience as children, and then they go on being repeated throughout our lives, depending on early experiences. So it's all very causal, linear, developmental. Whereas astrology is quite a different model because um, it's mythic, it's imaginative, and it's ancient. It has its own language and understanding of the human psyche, and it's not in that same way causal. It's more integrated so that the universal is and the individual reflect each other. So it's a much more holistic, in a sense, much more magical tradition. So they are very, very different in their approaches. And yet, both of them, if we just take, for example, the astrological chart, um, it is a whole chart. It's a map of wholeness. It's the whole universe at the time we're born, the cosmos. And yet, it's very clear from the way that the chart is constructed that it's constructed in a series of oppositions. So the signs are in opposite pairs. The aspects, the aspect of the opposition shows that the tension of opposites. The angles are also pairs of opposites, as are the nodal, the nodes. So, in spite of the fact that the whole is a picture of completeness, our experience of the world and of other people is kind of divided, is polar. And so um, that's one that's one approach which agrees with developmental psychology, which basically says that all of our experience comes through the development of the ego, the development, our adaptation or our adjustment to the world in which we find ourselves in, and how certain parts of our personality are developed and other parts fall into the shadow or into the unconscious. And so using both models of polarity, because being human, we tend to identify with one end only of a spectrum. And so there's a tremendous similarity between the two approaches, even though their methodology is quite different. Yeah.
I think just listening to you and having reading your book and my own experience as both a therapist and an astrologer, it strikes me that there is a huge amount of common ground
Mm.
that exists between psychology as we might understand it and astrology, certainly up until fairly recently. But I feel that the materialist worldview has infiltrated the psychological or the world of psychology to turn it into a much more disease-oriented, pharmaceutical oriented approach,
Yeah.
which actually not only is far from the ancient world of mythology, but it's also far from Jung and even Freud. It it feels like we've parted company more than ever before. What do you feel?
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think that's a very good observation, and I think that we live in an astonishingly polarized world. And those of us who live in the astrological world, which is full of omens and meaning and magic, really, I suppose, and these sort of ancient correspondences and all of the gods, because every planet is a god and they all are alive and they all have agendas and so on. Um, if we, if that's our world, it feels very, very bleak indeed and very strange to step outside and into the world of modern mainstream psychotherapy. And that was actually my own experience. I quite deliberately did a training which was going to inform me what was going on out there if you like, in the real world. And I didn't find any any indication, any interest even in the soul, which of course is right in the root of the word psychology. And that's something that James Hillman spoke about quite a lot. You know, the word psyche, which makes up the word psychology, the soul is nowhere to be found, or indeed the spirit. And therefore, The mainstream psychological, but also psychiatric and medical approach is diagnosis and medical treatment. So there doesn't seem to be, in my experience, any space allowed for for what Rollo May calls, this terrible lack of myth, which is absolutely critical to our sense of wholeness and well-being.
It's also lacking, from my point of view, humanity. Because, I mean, it was really only about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago that I was hearing about a great controversy because they were introducing into the DSM the bereavement as
Oh,
an illness,
well,
grief over the death as an illness, whereas most of us would recognize grief over the loss of someone as a natural human emotion or reaction. So this is where we're getting to, is that what is a normal or has been considered normal human reactions to situations, or perhaps replace the word normal with natural human reactions to situations, as being a cause for concern, to the point where it's a medical condition. This is, you were talking about polarizations. You can't get more polarized than this.
yes, 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 exactly right. And it does seem to be everywhere. And there's always behind that is lying the suspicion that the pharmaceutical companies have actually sort of got a grip, some kind of monopoly now on the human uh, condition. So that I believe also at the DSM-5, which it is now, I think that they're starting to bring in a medication which is meant to be preventative. Um, so so that brings in a whole new strata of medication in order to prevent things which, symptoms, I suppose, which may occur in the future, which is a is so much against the, if you think of the indigenous or more traditional way of viewing disease, even our own tradition, right back to Hippocrates, who said that each disease has its own cure embedded in it. And I mean, he was an advocate of letting the disease run its course, because how do we know what the meaning of a particular disease is? And that is not even given any space or consideration anymore. And yes, so we are. I think it's on one level, it's a very, very worrying situation.
Well, the hopeful side of things is, of course, that astrology is alive and well, and
Yes.
that the interest in astrology and the interest in astrology for a better understanding of the human existence, the human experience, and psychology is very alive and well. As a counterpoint to this, and of course, from a medical perspective, only 2 weeks ago, and it's just out on my other podcast, In the Light Growing Your Soul, I did an interview with a wonderful doctor, Dr. Jenny Goodman, who is an who practices ecological medicine, which is very much the antithesis of this approach to medicine. And in fact, she was actually expressing her concern over the way that psychotherapy and psychology have gone. So, first, we medicalized everything that could possibly appear on the body as a symptom. And now we're doing exactly the same thing with the mind, except when I say we, happily, it is not
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah.
So there is
It's
yet hope.
Yes, yes, there is. And I think there is also, in a way, something important to be gained from psychological thinking and psychological developments, which doesn't mean to say it's not embedded in a more ancient holistic approach to the human being, but it is this understanding of 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 this the way that we polarize um, in our development, and we come to identify with a particular small part, if you like, of our chart, um, and our becomes attached to certain aspects. And I think psychological thinking says yes, wherever the ego is, there is also the shadow. And if we're to become more integrated, more whole, and more complete, and more, I suppose, contented, then ultimately the route to do that is to include both ends of the axis, of every axis in the birth chart, which is a way of recognizing the importance of integration. And this is, of course, brings us right back to Jung, who was absolutely onto this, and how he recognized that um, integration of the shadow is just such an important part of the psyche's job. And so wholeness, very, very important. And so, but very, very hard to do, because our experience of opposites is um, is is very stressful. We find it very, very hard to integrate opposites, or to accept that this is me and this is me, um, rather than, and then to get caught up, and then we get caught up on um, it gets manifested in relationships. So,
It,
for example, sorry, yeah,
it certainly does get manifested in relationships. And I think looking at relationships, the thing that I've taught myself to do over time is when I meet the opposite and it upsets me, to say, oh, well, that's actually me. So
yeah,
which bit of me is this? Let's have a
yes,
look at which bit of me is this, because we don't like to admit that that thing we don't like may well be a part of us. But opposites also, I think, are important because sometimes they clarify. When we meet the opposite and we identify ourselves as opposite, that's a definition also of identity, which can be very helpful in clarifying who we are.
yes, exactly. And so basically, as you will know, the main part of the book is about looking at the opposites in each of the sign axes, and to see how, in fact, they depend on each other. They are complementary. And so, for example, if we look at the Cancer Capricorn axis, for every child archetype, if you like, there is a parent archetype. And if we identify with the child, then we're going to constantly be looking for the parent to look after us, and constantly feel misunderstood or underfed or needy and dependent. And equally, if we identify with the Capricorn side, with the parent side, then we won't allow any neediness or dependency, and so it becomes it relationships polarize, and you can see that the whole time, where a couple or anyone in a relationship has basically, they have agreed, there's a contract where they will fulfill the opposite ends of the same axis in order to complete it, but doesn't allow any room for individual growth or change, actually, for that matter.
No,
It's
because you're stuck in a role.
Yes, exactly that. Exactly.
I've always taught my students to look at opposites as being the same coin, two sides of the same
Mm,
coin,
mm,
and to not view them as these insurmountable obstacles. because it's, if you look at it as two sides of the same coin, then what you're seeing is exactly that. And it's much easier then to work on integration of the two. And I think the thing that in astrology really brought this home to me is the nodes.
Yes.
The nodes were the thing that really, when I was first learning, seems a very long time ago now, when I was first learning, really it made me think about opposites much more than, I was already kind of onto it, you know, with the angles of the chart. But when it came to the nodes, it really made me pay attention. And particularly when, for instance, you have one of the nodes in an opposition or in a conjunction with something else. So let's say the north node is conjunct the sun, but then you've got the south node there as well. And you're thinking, oh, or actually where it really made me think was where, let's say the sun would be conjunct the south node, and you're meant to be developing your sun sign, but you're also meant to be developing that north node.
Yes.
That it was that little conundrum that really got me thinking, and it didn't take me long to kind of think, okay, so let's aim for integration and balance.
Yes. I think the nodes are a really good way into this necessity to grapple with opposites and to include both, and to see that one end of a polarity cannot be considered without the other end. And because of our language is so binary. We don't, we have subject and object all the time in our language. It's not so easy to find words which integrate the opposites. And so we find it harder to think in that way. So, I think that's why I was trying to find words to describe each axis. So, for example, um, resources. I mean, the axis of, for example, um, Taurus and Scorpio. What that's about resources in some way. My resources, your resources. But depending where we sit on that spectrum, it can generate enormous possessiveness and, or a sense of being without or withheld. And so it generates a whole story, unless we can actually really recognize that we have to have a sufficient amount of self-esteem and self-worth in order to be able to share our resources. Otherwise, there's an imbalance of power, and so that triggers a whole lot of stories, which in fact became my main method for communicating the truth or the lived experience of each of these six axes, was through story, and through myths, and through fairy stories, and films, and books, and so on, because it's in literature, it's in art, literature, and film that we can actually see the whole complexity of these axes played out in the context of a story that we can actually then hopefully understand or find ourselves a part of, and would help us to see what the dilemmas are.
And that, I think, is one of the big differences, again, between the ancient approach to the human, shall we say, predicament, and the material scientist approach that we see in terms of psychotherapy and psychology, is the actual language. It's a very different way of articulating human experience.
Yes.
One is very cold and, as you said earlier, causal, and it treats the mind and human experience as functions and systems which go awry,
Yeah.
whereas the other encompasses feeling. And the reason why it's so important, story is so important when we're talking about feeling, is because there's no real logic behind feeling. Feeling just is, or emotion just is. It's an energy. It's an
Yeah.
energy that's difficult to articulate in its full spectrum and in all of the layers that accompany it. So therefore, there is story is the way to express and articulate. And I think that that's something that certainly Jung understood
Yeah.
very, very well.
Yeah. Yes. And it removes the temptation to judge. A story is just a story, and it doesn't tell you what you should do. It just tells you, it sets out a whole scenario, and it leaves it leaves the whole question in balance. It's about experience. It's not judgmental or prescriptive. It's imaginative, and I think that that's kind of really what lies at the root of the magic of astrology. And I think if we're talking about the relationship between modern mainstream psychotherapy or um, yeah, psychiatry, um, the the gods, the astrological gods, or the Greek gods, or the gods of any culture, display an enormous range of dysfunctional um, um, characteristics. And in that sense, they in fact display all of the human failings, if you like: jealousy, rage, they murder, they punish each other, they treat each other really appallingly, and in a way we can see ourselves reflected, obviously, in these characteristics. Jealousy, particularly, um, um, and we do not have to pathologize it. And so I think one of the things I wanted to to do was to expand the bandwidth of what is nowadays considered to be normal, so that we're not always, as you said earlier, having to medicate for everything. I mean, the idea of medicating for grief is just horrifying to me. It's exactly the same. When I was doing my training, there was a scientific article came out which was to the effect that the entire brain, human brain, had now been thoroughly scanned, and they could say now, without question, that there is no such thing as the soul, because they didn't find it.
I'm sorry, I just think that's hysterical
Yeah.
because it's that hubris, isn't it? And there are plenty of myths around the hubris of
Yes.
humanity.
Yes, there are.
And you
Yes.
think, aren't we just setting ourselves up for a major fall? And wow,
Yes.
that's brilliant. And you see these extraordinary claims being made, and and you think to yourself, well, hmm, I wonder how long before this particular bubble receives is burst.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, uh, and you also wonder, I think, when, like ourselves, when you have a foot in the other world, I wonder how people can actually take these things seriously. How their thinking can be so materialistic and so spectacularly reductionist that they don't actually see they don't seem to be able to understand what they're saying, as you say, from the hubris point of view. It's astounding. It's
It
astounding.
is, but then I mean, I think the only way that we could possibly begin to understand the level of myopia around this subject is to see it as a religion in its own right.
Mm,
This is an act of faith now for
yes.
many. So this is why there is this extraordinary myopia
Yes.
in many. It's I wouldn't say it's by any means in the whole of the scientific community. It is not, but it is prevalent um, there to the point where not long ago they were referring to anything connected with the study of consciousness as the C word. So that that's the level that we're at there, and thankfully things have begun to shift um, in that context. But we know where we are. So coming back to polarities, I think I love to see that, and I guess this is what I was thinking when I was listening to you is the what I love about the astrology chart is that all of these myths and all of these stories are in the chart.
Mm,
We all have Jupiter in our charts. We all have Pluto in our charts. We all have every one of these larger than life, mythical, um, passionate, imperfect, volatile gods
yes.
in our charts. And they're all vying with one another, as they did in the ancient worldview.
Mm,
And why that's so precious to see it in the chart is because it shows us our humanity, what we are as human beings. Okay, we've learned to tone things down a little bit for the sake of avoiding murder and being murdered, but you know,
yeah.
it's there. And to see that in that large language, like the language that speaks to us in our dreams, in fact,
Yes.
it's a beautiful tool, because if we can just make peace between Jupiter and Saturn in our charts, we don't have to have them peace, you know, in the world or in the cosmos, but in our own charts,
Mm.
in ourselves. Wouldn't we be a lot happier?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, for sure. For sure. And they are all alive within us. They all have a motivation. They all have a focus. They all have a desire, whichever way they want to be expressed. And they all get triggered on a regular basis through the transits and progressions. And so there's an enormous, great pantheon of a huge play, isn't there, working itself out in each one of us through which we can see in our charts, which, yes, which includes the gods. It does not, it doesn't exclude them. And I'm always come back to that saying of Jung's, which is, you know, in our times the gods have become diseases, you know. So we no longer are able to accept the gods in our lives. So, for example, Neptune, you know, this great king of the oceans, of the sea, and you know the storms and the confusion and tidal waves and all of that, has now just if it's pathologized, it just becomes depression. Well, you know, what's the point of that except to medicate? Because what else can the medical profession do with depression? They're not going to look at it mythically or from a point of view of the soul or bereavement or anything else. They're just going to prescribe. And so, in fact, it's quite, I think we really do have to hold on to our worldview if we want to stay sane, and more to the point, if we want to stay healthy.
And human. I would add
Absolutely.
human and humane. I think I would add those two words in there, because this is our humanity, and in understanding our humanity, we are more humane. And so, yet again, I feel I owe you a great debt for your wonderful book. And I thank you for this wonderful interview.
You're very welcome, Anna. It's been a pleasure.
And the book that we have been discussing, and which I urge you to go and find, is Star-Crossed. And the link to it will be on the description box. And Claire, if people wanted to find out more about your work, how do they do that?
Oh, well, um, I I have a lot of webinars on the MISPA website, the Mercury Internet School of Psychological Astrology website, where I am a supervisor, and there's quite a bit of material there. And there's, of course, my 5 books now, which are all been published by the Wessex Astrologer. So, and I've just been teaching at the faculty summer school in Oxford, which was a wonderful experience. So there's always the summer school. I think that's a great way for astrologers to give themselves a treat. Have a week in Oxford and just with a whole lot of astrological colleagues and friends and learning. So I'm around. I'm not envisaging writing any more books at the moment. But yeah, yeah.
Well, I will find some of those and put them on the description box as well. And gutted to hear you haven't got another book in the offing, but hopeful that before long something will emerge.
Well, who knows? Okay, lovely.
Once again.
Okay.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at lunar mansions. Until then, goodbye.